And so clearly what's happening in Detroit, not only Detroit, but I need you to understand that Detroit is ground zero for a national problem, right? Recent research shows that Blacks and Latinos pay on average a 10 to 13% higher property tax rate than whites for the same bundle of goods.
When we talk about wealth in America, we're often told it's about responsibility, the choices we make, and hard work. But what if that left out the fact that there's policies that often quietly shape who gets wealth, who builds wealth, and who doesn't? My guest today is Bernadette Atuahene. She is a law professor and author of Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America. Her work exposes how racist housing and tax policies have stripped wealth from Black families, often without naming race at all. This is a conversation about Detroit, but it's also a conversation about America. Your book opens with the story of two men, Grandpa Bucci, I hope I'm saying it right, and Grandpa Brown. Both are arriving in Detroit with similar hopes. Why do you begin with their stories? And what do these families reveal about race that shapes opportunity in America?
Yeah. So, my book, Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America, really does start with two grandfathers. And as you said, they both came to Detroit around the same time, to the same factory to work at Ford's River Rouge factory. And so many things about these men are similar. They were both sharecroppers in their places of origin. Grandpa Bucci was a sharecropper in Italy under a system called Mezzadria. And Grandpa Brown was an American sharecropper from North Carolina. And so two men with very similar starting points, right? They're coming to Detroit at the same time to work at the same factory. You think they would have similar outcomes. And the book shows you that because of racist policies, Grandpa Brown had a very different experience than Grandpa Bucci. So now Grandpa Bucci, he didn't have an easy life. He was Italian before Italians became white. And he actually had in one of his hands only four fingers because his thumb got sliced off in a work accident when he worked in the coal mines of France before he came to Detroit. So Grandpa Bucci at no point had an easy life. But at no point did Grandpa Bucci have to deal with racially restrictive covenants, which are covenants tucked in deeds that prevented Black people from living in the best parts of the city and, more importantly, from living in the suburbs. Grandpa Bucci never had an easy life, but at no point did him or his community face redlining, where the federal government drew a red line around the community, preventing valuable investment because they said it was a credit risk, and with the ultimate result being blight once you are suffocated from investment. So, although Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, at no point was his community subjected to urban renewal, which is because of the blight created by redlining. Entire communities were bulldozed, were completely razed to get rid of blight. But not only did they get rid of the blighted homes, but they got rid of the unblighted homes, the productive Black businesses, the cultural institutions. They took everything, not just bricks and mortar. And more importantly, they took the social capital that tied people together, that made neighbors like family, and that kept the Black community together. And in place, after urban renewal, masses of people were transported to a few areas where segregation would allow them to reside. And in place of tightly knit communities, you now had communities of strangers that are vulnerable to disorder. And so I can go on, but you can see that these Grandpa Bucci didn't have it easy, but at no point did he have to deal with all of these racist policies. And at the end of the day, Grandpa Bucci gave his house. His house was inherited by his grandson in a city, Detroit suburb called Livonia, and it's worth over $300,000. And Grandpa Bucci's grandson lives there now. Grandpa Brown, his granddaughter, Myrisha, inherited his home. And because of these layers and layers of racist policies, Grandpa Brown's home was worth less than $10,000 when Myrisha inherited it. Yet the stories we tell in America is that Grandpa Bucci and his descendants have what they have because they worked hard. I'm here to tell you that Grandpa Brown worked hard too.
I I lived in Detroit for a period of time and understand some of the dynamics of what you're talking about as far as the geography and where things are. And I wonder when you went there to Detroit and saw the disparity and understanding the stories, how did that make you feel as a individual who, who is obviously passionate about justice?
Yeah, so all my work deals with land stolen from Black people. And I also do ethnography, which means I live and immerse myself in the place I study. So my first ethnography was actually in South Africa, where I looked at land stolen during apartheid and colonialism and did an ethnography of the Land Restitution Commission's attempt to give people land and money back. And my current ethnography, and actually how I actually got to Detroit, was I was tired of studying Black people getting stolen from, and I wanted to study Black people doing the stealing. So I decided I wanted to do a project on squatting, where vulnerable populations are taken instead of being taken from. And so I got a big National Science Foundation grant to study squatting in Detroit, because what's currently happening with squatting in Detroit far outpaces anything that we've had in an urban area in the recent past in America. And so I got this big grant, and in the law, there are two kinds of squatters: a takeover, which is what normal people think of as a squatter, someone who rolls up onto a piece of property with no prior legal relationship to that property. But there are also holdovers, right? People who had a legal relationship to the property and fell out of it. So when I was interviewing the holdovers, one person after the next said they were the owner, and then they got tax foreclosed and they stayed waiting for the new owners to arrive. And I was like, tax foreclosure? At that point, I knew a lot about mortgage foreclosure as a property scholar, but I knew very little about tax foreclosure. So I had to start doing my homework. And I soon found that since 2009, 1 in 3 homes have completed the property tax foreclosure process in Detroit. 1 in 3. We haven't seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. And so I had to call NSF and say, look, I know I'm here to study, you gave me money to study squatting, but I've got to switch to property tax foreclosure because my neighbors, this is not a game, it's not theoretical. I live in the place I study. My neighbors are losing their homes in droves, and they gave me the okay. And I changed my project to studying property tax foreclosure. And my first study found that between 2009 and 2015, in each of those 7 years, anywhere between 53 and 84% of the homes the city of Detroit was assessing in violation of the Michigan state constitution, which quite clearly says no property can be assessed at more than 50% of the property's market value. And so, this is kind of my personal story in terms of how I actually got to Detroit to be doing this work. And in fact, I wanted to study Black agency, but I was put in the position of once again studying Black dispossession.
Mm. Mm. I want to go back to the story because it's really important. I think some of the points that you bring out, and you talk about these men's stories as they unfold, their families, they take dramatic different paths. What do these parallel journeys help us understand about, I guess, structural forces that are shaping Black and white wealth in America?
Yeah, I think it's a very important story. Again, it's one thing to be told about someone to tell you about intergenerational wealth, and that it's another thing for you to see it in a story. And so that's the power of my book, Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America. As I show it to you through the stories of these two men. And one of the most important kind of results of the book is to really understand that when you look at the Black community, right? And people say, well, why is the Black community having all these problems, right? And guess who gets the blame? What's visible? The Black people living in that community. These racist policies have no shoulders on which to carry the blame. These racist policies are doing big work, yet they're invisible. And so part of what my book is trying to do is making the invisible visible so that we can understand when we look at the Black community that the state of the Black community, it has a lot to do with these layers and layers of racist policies. Again, racially restrictive covenants, redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal, predatory mortgage lending, and now predatory property tax administration.
I listened to an interview that you did recently, and you said something that was so spot on, and I want you to explain it to the audience as well. You said that policies or racist policies don't necessarily need intent to
That's
create
right.
racist outcomes. Can you explain
Yes.
a little bit more about that so people can
Yes, Esther, thank
understand
you for
that?
asking. Yes. So, Americans and America are that we're obsessed with intent, right? We're on the hunt, honey, for the racist. We're looking for the rate where Hollywood has taught us to look for good guys and bad guys, black hats and white hats, right? And so we are busy looking for the racist when what we need to do is to be looking for systems that produce racial inequity. No matter who is, and the thing about a system is you can replace a person and the system can still be producing those racial inequities. And so we have to, and that's part of what the call of this book, again, Plundered, How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America. The call is for America to switch its focus from this, looking for the racist to understanding racist policies. And I use our dear brother Ibram Kendi's definition of racist policy, meaning any policy, practice, procedure, law that produces or sustains racial inequity. And so once we shift our focus from the racist to racist policies, now we can get to work on disassembling those racist policies. That's the work, right? And not about this focus on individuals and corrupt individuals. That's not the work.
We're now hearing arguments that programs designed to repair inequity, like in housing and in education and in access, are somehow discriminatory against white people. From a legal and historical perspective, how do we talk about distinguishing the true nature of racism and understanding that is not what racism is?
Yeah, and I mean, this is this whole colorblind ideology.
Hey, if this conversation is resonating with you, please do me a big favor. Support my work by subscribing to the channel. It's free and it helps me continue bringing you conversations like this week after week.
That is going, colorblind. It's all we should be colorblind. Well, again, all that is code word for colorblind is ignoring history. And it's not even ignoring history, it's selective ignoring of selective histories, right? Because they, seem to understand history when it's recreating the Civil War, and they seem to understand history when they want to keep the Confederate flag and raise the Confederate flag, right? It's a selective erasure of selective histories. That's the work that color blindness is doing, and we just need to call it out for what it is. It's an erasure of history, a selective erasure of history. It's just that simple.
Well, you pointed out that Detroit isn't unique and that similar patterns also are in other cities. How widespread is predatory governance in the US?
Yeah, so predatory governance is a term I create in my book, Plundered, How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America. And predatory governance, I define as when local governments raise public dollars through policies or procedures that sustain or create racial inequity, right? And so clearly what's happening in Detroit, not only Detroit, but I need you to understand that Detroit is ground zero for a national problem, right? Recent research shows that Blacks and Latinos pay on average a 10 to 13% higher property tax rate than whites for the same bundle of goods, which equals about 10 to 13% more. I'm sorry, $200 to $300 more per year. So, with 1 in 3 homes completing the property tax foreclosure process since 2009, Detroit is best understood as ground zero for this national problem, right? So, it is a national a problem. And yeah, and so I forgot what I was talking about.
Well, we're talking about that Detroit isn't just it's also not just in Detroit. I saw that you put
Yes, good.
Washington
And with all
D.C.
of
and
good, with
other
yes.
areas as
And
well.
with all of these, so that's what I'm, yes. So it's not just Detroit, it's a national problem. And all of these racist policies I'm talking about happened in lots of different places, right? When they talk about racial covenants and redlining and block busing, this happened throughout America, throughout Black communities throughout America. And so this is really a lot of these themes in the book, although it's using Detroit as a case study. It's really telling a national story. And again, how we need to understand racialized property tax administration and these illegally inflated property taxes in Detroit and other places is as the latest chapter in a longer history of racist policies.
You don't just diagnose the problem, though. You offer a roadmap. What reforms or community strategies are the things that you think that should be focused on now?
Absolutely. So we have something called the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, and the coalition has three goals and three goals only. It's a coalition of about a dozen grassroots organizations in Detroit. And number one, we want to stop these illegally inflated property taxes in Detroit and throughout the nation. Number two, we want to stop the ongoing foreclosures in Detroit until we can make sure that people are being foreclosed upon for taxes they actually owe instead of illegally inflated property taxes. And then number three, we want to compensation, right? And so those are the three goals. And we have had several wins. We are deep into power building. So we call it our holy trinity of power building, otherwise known as community organizing, research, and legal advocacy. And through this holy trinity, we have had several wins. Number one, we've prevented over 13,000 homes from going to tax foreclosure by advocating for a property tax foreclosure moratorium in 2020 through 2024. We have appealed the illegally inflated property taxes of over 1,000 Detroit homeowners completely free of charge. We've helped over 1,000 homeowners pay their illegally inflated property tax debt by putting them in touch with ARPA money. And we have already raised $6 million for compensation. And the Detroit News tells us that Detroit stole over $600 million. So $6 million is to be understood as a start. And last but not least, we have something called the Dignity Restoration Project. And with the Dignity Restoration Project, we're raising $100 million to compensate the hardest hit Detroiters. And those are Detroiters who lost their homes, due to their failure to pay illegally inflated property taxes that they weren't supposed to be paying in the first place because they qualified for the poverty tax exemption. In Michigan, if you live below the poverty line, you don't have to pay property taxes. And in fact, but the city of Detroit made that entitlement so difficult for them to get that they lost their homes for illegally inflated property taxes that they weren't supposed to be paying in the first place. And this Dignity Restoration Project is intended to compensate this particular group of people. And if your listeners are interested, it's dignityrestorationproject.org, dignityrestorationproject.org.
I guess my final question is, what do you hope that readers and lawmakers and everyday people who pick up your book will get from it when they finish?
I want us two things. Number one, I want us to be able to identify these narratives of personal irresponsibility that are so prevalent in this case of property tax overassessment, but whenever vulnerable populations are involved, right? So it's always, oh, Detroiters bought homes they couldn't afford. Oh, Detroiters should have went to go file an appeal. Oh, Detroiters just don't want to pay their taxes. These are all narratives of personal irresponsibility. And we need to shift the narrative to one that focuses on the structural injustice. No, Detroiters are losing their homes at record rates, historic rates, because of these illegally inflated property taxes, right? Because once we allow these narratives of personal irresponsibility to flourish and to stand, what actually my research shows what ends up happening is it mires people in shame because they internalize these narratives of personal irresponsibility and they beat themselves up for losing mama's house or losing granddaddy's house. And guess what you can't do when you're mired in shame? You can't fight back. Shame causes you to hide in the corner, right? And so the first thing we had to do before anything is to shift these narratives through the research to highlight the structural injustices, highlight the racist policy, right? And then we could start the organizing because once you lift the shame, that creates room for righteous indignation and for the fight back to begin. We could not have created the Coalition for Property Tax Justice without doing that narrative work first of shifting from narratives of personal irresponsibility to narratives of structural injustice. So that's number one. The first thing that we have to do and why that's important. And the next thing is, why I love the term racist policy is because we need to identify the policies that are causing the racial inequity that we are speaking of. So in this instance, why is it that what's going on in Detroit? Part of it is because The state of Michigan has an 18% interest penalty on all delinquent property taxes, as if the problem is people have the money, but they just don't want to pay, rather than poverty is preventing them from paying. And so you kind of list, so that's what the book does. It lists out all the various policies that are contributing to this racial inequity. And that way we can get to work on disassembling those policies. Once we talk about things like structural justice, that's so, what is that? That's like, what are you talking about? No, the person making the claim has to make the claim about the policies and list out the actual the policies that are causing the racial inequity. Once that work is done, again, then we can collectively get to work on disassembling those policies, right? That's the work, instead of wasting our time searching around for the racist and obsessed with intent, right? We need to get to work on disassembling those racist policies. So that's what I hope people get from my book, Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America.
My guest has been Bernadette Atuahene. I love saying that name. It just sounds like poetry in your mouth. Author of Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America. You can find her book wherever books are sold, and you can learn more about her work through the Coalition for Property Tax Justice and the Dignity Restoration Project. Thanks for joining me for this conversation. I'm Esther Dillard, and this is The Color Between the Lines.